In the bustling ports of 18th century Britain, merchants in fine coats stride purposefully, discussing profits over steaming cups of coffee. Sailors load ships with textiles and weapons bound for distant shores. The air is buzzing with excitement about new opportunities and exotic luxuries. But those same ships will soon be packed with human cargo. Men, women, and children torn from their homes in Africa. Chained together, with no space to move, many will not survive the horrific journey across the Atlantic. This was the reality of the Triangle Trade, a route that connected Britain, Africa, and the Americas in a cycle of commerce and cruelty. It brought unprecedented wealth to British ports and helped fuel the Industrial Revolution. But at the same time, it came at a terrible cost in human suffering. Prepare for a tale of two worlds colliding, where the comforts of some were built on the torment of many. This is the story of slavery's triangle trade. As dawn breaks over the bustling docks of 18th century Liverpool, a flurry of activity begins. Merchants in fine coats march along the wharves, checking manifests and barking orders. Sailors and dockworkers haul crates and barrels onto waiting ships, their muscles straining as they load valuable cargo bound for distant shores. The air is filled with excitement and optimism about the profits to be made. In nearby taverns and coffee houses, ship captains and investors gather to discuss the latest news over steaming cups of coffee, an exotic luxury made possible by slave labor on distant plantations. For many Britons, this trade brings unprecedented prosperity. Shop windows display gleaming sugar bowls and delicate porcelain teacups. Well-to-do ladies admire bolts of brightly colored cotton fabrics, while gentlemen savor tobacco from ornate pipes. The wealth from slavery also reshaped entire cities. In Liverpool, Bristol, and London, grand new buildings arose. Elegant town halls and imposing warehouses sprang up along bustling docks, while wealthy slave traders built luxurious homes in fashionable new neighborhoods. The profits of slavery were enormous. A single enslaved person in good condition could be sold for £25 in the Caribbean, nearly a year's wages for the average British worker. As ships prepared to depart, the captains focused on maximizing profits by purchasing the most profitable cargo and planning the best destinations. Typical destinations might be the coasts of modern-day Ghana, Angola, or Mozambique. As the ships set sail, the brutal reality of the Middle Passage lies ahead. 8 weeks later, as European ships approach trading stations on the African coast, word spreads quickly that the slave traders have returned. In some areas, local leaders have become complicit in the trade, capturing people from rival tribes or villages to sell to the Europeans. In others, armed European raiders stormed villages themselves, violently tearing families apart. Imagine being torn from your home and forced into a dark, cramped dungeon. This was the horrifying reality for millions of Africans captured in the slave trade. At coastal forts like Elmina Castle in Ghana, enslaved people endured nightmarish conditions while awaiting ships bound for the Americas. The dungeons were hellish places. Hundreds of captives were crammed into tiny, airless rooms with no sanitation. Disease spread rapidly in these filthy conditions. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of human waste, sweat, and despair. Many didn't survive the wait, succumbing to illness or malnutrition before even boarding a ship. The contrast between the dungeons and the rest of the fort was shocking. While captives suffered below, European traders lived comfortably in airy rooms above. At Elmina, there was even a church right next to the dungeons. Before boarding ships, captives were subjected to humiliating examinations. Stripped naked, they were prodded and inspected like cattle. Those deemed fit for the journey were branded with hot irons, marking them as property. It was a final painful reminder that in the eyes of their captors, they were no longer human beings but merely cargo. For many, The horrors of the holding pens were just the beginning of an even more terrifying journey across the Atlantic. Known as the Middle Passage, this infamous voyage typically lasted between 60 to 90 days. Slave ships were floating prisons designed to pack in as many human beings as possible. Captives were crammed into spaces with ceilings as low as 5 feet. In some areas, sleeping shelves cut this limited headroom in half. Ships often carried 300 to 400 people in these tiny areas. There was barely enough room to move, let alone maintain basic hygiene. The combination of overcrowding, poor ventilation, and tropical heat created a breeding ground for deadly illnesses. Dysentery, smallpox, and scurvy were common. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of human waste, sweat, and despair. Captains and crew members often treated the enslaved with shocking cruelty. Those who tried to resist or starve themselves were tortured. Women and girls faced the constant threat of sexual assault and rape. The Middle Passage exacted a devastating human cost. It's estimated that 15 to 16% of enslaved people died during the voyage. Those who did survive arrived physically and emotionally traumatized. They faced an uncertain future in a strange land, separated from their families and everything they had ever known. Upon reaching the Americas, enslaved Africans faced new terrors. For many, this would be their first glimpse of the land where they would be forced to spend the rest of their lives in bondage. The arrival process was dehumanizing and cruel. Enslaved people were herded off the ships like cattle, often still chained together. Many were weak from the journey, barely able to stand after weeks cramped in the ship's hold. The sudden bright sunlight hurt their eyes after so long in darkness. Before being sold, they were subjected to humiliating preparations. This involved being stripped naked and scrubbed with rough brushes to make their skin appear healthier and more attractive to buyers. Some were even forced to dance or jump to prove their physical fitness. Next was the auction block. This was a place of heartbreak and terror. Families who had managed to stay together during the Middle Passage were often torn apart, never to see each other again. Children were ripped from their mothers' arms. Husbands and wives were sold to different owners. Buyers would inspect the enslaved people like livestock, checking their teeth, muscles, and overall health. The highest bidder would become the new owner of these human beings. For the enslaved, the auction marked the beginning of a new life of hardship and suffering. Some would be sent to work on brutal sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Others would face backbreaking labor in the cotton fields of the American South. A lucky few might become house servants, but all would face a lifetime of exploitation and abuse. But for the traders, life went on. As the sun rose over bustling Caribbean ports, enslaved workers hauled heavy crates and barrels onto waiting ships. These vessels, which had arrived months earlier packed with human cargo, were now being loaded for their return journey to Europe. The holds that once contained the misery of enslaved Africans were now filled with the fruits of their forced labor. Huge barrels of raw sugar, sticky molasses, and pungent rum, all produced on sprawling plantations, were carefully stowed. Bales of cotton were packed tightly. Tobacco leaves, dried and bundled, filled the air with their distinct aroma. But it wasn't just plantation goods being loaded. From the forests of North America came valuable timber, furs, and naval stores like tar and pitch. Salted cod from New England fisheries was packed into barrels, and from the Spanish colonies to the south came precious metals, gold and silver that would fill European coffers. The loading process was a dangerous dance of heavy lifting and precise placement. Every inch of space had to be used efficiently to maximize profits. Ship captains oversaw the operation with a keen eye, knowing that their cut depended on a successful voyage. For the enslaved workers doing the loading, it was a bitter irony. Many had arrived on these very ships, torn from their homes in Africa. Now they were forced to load the products of their own exploitation, destined for European markets they would never see. As the final crates were secured, the ship's crew began preparations for the long Atlantic crossing. Sails were unfurled, rigging checked, and provisions loaded. With a favorable wind, the leg back to Europe might take 6 to 8 weeks. After that, the journey could begin. All over again. To learn more about other monumental events in history, click here.